Retro video games, a frontier saturated with internet content coverage. These are the chronicled journeys of Segalacious, his quest to seek out high-quality Sega games, purchase, play, and appreciate them. In this nostalgic pursuit, he will go where plenty of gamers have probably gone before. The Sega Saturn is my favorite video game console of all time. It is a system that, despite its popularity in Japan, is largely forgotten by gamers in the United States. To many of those old enough to recall when the Saturn was relevant, it remains a misunderstood and even reviled system. Growing up, my brothers and I were the only kids we knew who had even played the system, much less owned one. We had a handful of some pretty excellent games. Of course, we dug into the triple pack version of Virtua Fighter 2, Virtua Cop, and Daytona USA, but we also had access to Tomb Raider, Resident Evil, and Street Fighter Alpha 2. The demo discs we found in the triple pack advertised a host of games that we could find no trace of at any local stores. To my great frustration, I would never lay hands or eyes on the coveted Panzer Dragoon or Nights into Dreams during the all-too-brief time period that our Sega Saturn remained functional. Since that time, I vowed to hunt down and play the best games that the Saturn had to offer, no matter how long it would take me. Decades later, this is the result of that search. My collection has some glaring absences, with more than a few missing or poor quality cases and manuals. There is still a long way to go before reaching my goal of collecting the full set for the North American Sega Saturn region, but I would still like to appreciate how far I have come since the days of my youth. This video is a prologue to a new video series called Sega Trek. In it, I will be doing deep dives into the most worthwhile games for all Sega consoles. For now, I would like to just briefly share each game in my Sega Saturn collection thus far. Since I have over 60 games, this prologue is going to take a little while, so if you're up for a long montage of Saturn goodness, sit back, crack open a beverage, and enjoy a nostalgic stroll through my library of games on the Sega Saturn. Since the tour through my collection is going to be done alphabetically, our first stop will be none other than Albert Odyssey, Legend of Eldain. Produced by Sunsoft and localized to North America by Working Designs, this Japanese role-playing game was originally intended for release on the Super Famicom. It was supposed to be a kind of spin-off or side story game connected to the Japanese-only Albert Odyssey on the Super Famicom. Late into the game's development, this failed to pan out, and it was scooped up and ported to the Sega Saturn with a fully orchestrated soundtrack. As is typical of Working Design's releases, the quality of its physical media makes it a highly sought-after game by collectors. The box art is beautiful, and the disc is gorgeous. Not to mention the manual is an impressive artistic feat. I still find myself enthralled by the shiny foil stamped cover and colorful anime-styled artwork on nearly every page. Unfortunately, the case hinge is broken and the manual is missing the little perforated mail-in slip, but that's the condition I found it in. Honestly, I felt lucky to find it in the wild at all, and the guy selling it to me gave me a pretty good deal. It definitely shows that this game originated as an old-school Super Nintendo JRPG, but I actually love the old-fashioned sprite work in this game. Its art style provides an interesting contrast to the game's surprisingly dark opening.
No! Master, I failed you, but I shall not fail the child.
I haven't yet come anywhere near beating this game, but the combat seems pretty run-of-the-mill. That's actually fine by me. It always cracks me up to see enemies disintegrate after losing all their hit points. In fact, I often find myself adding sound effects to the death animations while playing. Working Designs seems to have taken a lot of liberties with localizing the translation of this game's dialogue. Some of the dialogue options are outright hilarious, and the witty banter coupled with occasional slapstick humor makes me want to keep coming back for more. Albert Odyssey, Legend of Eldain, is a game that absolutely oozes charm, and that alone is enough to place it securely among my most favorite titles for the Sega Saturn. Alone in the Dark, One-Eyed Jack's Revenge is the sequel to the landmark survival horror game that inspired Capcom's Resident Evil. In it, you play as a detective whose goal is to rescue a little girl from a mansion infested with zombie gangsters possessed by the ghosts of One-Eyed Jack's pirate crew? It's kind of confusing, hopefully I got that right. I don't know a whole lot about this series, but I respect it for almost single-handedly building the genre that games such as Resident Evil and Silent Hill later began to dominate. From what I can gather, this installment has departed from its predecessor's emphasis on horror in favor of a more action-oriented approach. This game came bundled with a collector's phone card with 5 free minutes preloaded onto it for players to get tips and hints from a hotline. I suspect these 5 minutes would have typically been used up on asking for advice on how the controls are supposed to work. Actually, if you bother reading the manual, it does explain how combat and environmental interactions are supposed to work. The controls aren't the most responsive and can be pretty frustrating, but if you take the time to learn them properly, they actually are serviceable enough. Visually, the Saturn port is pretty weak when compared to the PlayStation, thanks to how messy the pixelated textures look. In fact, I think I even prefer the 3DO's flat shaded models over the Saturn's. That aside, once I started to learn the controls and got used to the poor frame rate, I was surprised that I was actually having fun with the game, even if I couldn't get past the hedge maze and into the mansion itself. I think that there is more to appreciate in this game than most people give it credit for. While I haven't played too much of it, I think I actually kind of like this game and will probably play it again and try to get further. A Stall is a game that I have spoken of at length in a past video. I consider it to be an aesthetic and artistic masterpiece, a testament to how the power of strong art direction can help visuals to age gracefully, and a glimpse into the potential of the greatness 2D games could have had during the 32-bit era if not for the premature emphasis placed onto 3D style projects during the time period. But looking at the North American box art, you would never know it. Those who tend to judge a book by its cover probably would not have been enticed by the non-anime 90s art style that made A Stall more resemble a treasure troll than faithfully capturing the game's art design. This poor advertising is compounded by the fact that the spine is the only Saturn game in my collection without the title printed on it. Unless the game was facing out on store shelves, this would have made it pretty difficult to make an impression back in the day. The manual is in black and white, but at least it has quite a bit of lore printed inside regarding Astal's storyline.
Somewhere in the universe, the goddess Antawas created a world from a single jewel. She created the earth, water, sky, and air. And 2 humans from a red jewel and a green jewel.
It also has some pretty helpful explanations of the game's mechanics, including how to use the bird to help heal you or even attack. There is even a form of 2-player co-op in the game, in which player 2 plays as the bird and shares health with player 1. While the controls are not the tightest in the 2D platforming genre, Astal is a more than competent and thoroughly enjoyable adventure in spite of its stingy limitations on extra lives and continues in the North American release. I still consider Astal to be the best looking game for the Sega Saturn of all. Astal's themes are primordial, mythic even, and the quality of this unique title, for me, makes it an uncontroversial pick as one of the most legendary titles for the Sega Saturn. A series credited with being the first 3D weapons-based fighter, Battle Arena Toshinden was first launched on the Sony PlayStation in 1995. Marketing campaigns hailed the game as a Saturn killer that aimed to outdo the success of Virtua Fighter in the home console domain. About half a year later, it was ported to the Sega Saturn and dubbed Battle Arena Toshinden Remix. In terms of gameplay and visuals, I think that the PlayStation version has the Saturn beat. Maybe it's just me, but the controls feel less responsive and the gameplay feels significantly slower, making the experience feel somewhat sluggish by comparison. The lack of transparency effects and odd texturing on character models and stages make the visual presentation slightly less appealing than what was accomplished on the PlayStation. However, the Saturn port offers a much more robust story mode with a lot of hilariously bad voice acting in the English dub.
Kyan, I don't want to fight you.
You think I do? But we've come this far. I must avenge my father's death, and you must find Sho. But only one of us can go on. Those are the rules.
I know where we stand. We must fight.
Yes, we must fight.
This actually endears the Saturn version to me, and I found myself getting pretty interested in the storyline. There is also an extra character present in this version of the game, but I never really bothered to unlock him. While I do respect the influence that this game has had on 3D fighting games such as Soul Edge, I don't really think that it's a fighting game that has stood the test of time. Even though the gameplay is a marginally smoother experience on the PlayStation, the fact is that Battle Arena Toshinden at its best still falls short of titles such as Virtua Fighter. Due to this consideration, I actually have to recommend the Saturn version over the PlayStation. Despite the legacy it left behind, the biggest reason to return to this series isn't so much for the gameplay, at least for me, but for the story. In this regard, the Saturn version stands out to me as the one to own, purely for the nostalgic novelty of its voice-acted storyline.
You're good. You are Amo's son.
Did you know my father?
He defeated me utterly years ago. He fought like you. After our fight, I never saw him again.
I learned to fight from a master. Sho, the brother of my best friend. Do you know him?
You learned from him? He won the last tournament. He even fought Master. He is called the Stranger.
So? No, that must be a lie.
You know it is not.
I won't believe it.
Come, see with your own eyes. Soon you will meet the Stranger.
Blackfire is a helicopter combat simulator released in North America on November 10, 1995, developed by the Sega OA team. It has a pretty cool opening cinematic. But unfortunately, the controls make the combat a struggle for me to enjoy. There are a variety of different weapons in the form of missiles and a mounted machine gun, whose bullets remind me of mini golf or ping pong balls.
We got snakes warming up! Check radar!
In its day, the graphics and art style were aiming for a gritty and realistic presentation, something that was more of a novelty back in the 90s than it is today.
Your primary mission objective is the heavily guarded Central Command bunker located within the inner compound. Be advised, your time over target must be met before the arrival of federal law enforcement agents. Remember, this is a clandestine operation. Keep your flight time short, avoid civilian contact. Our Overlord spy sat has already fed your target's laser signature to the Blackfire's tactical computer. Good hunting.
I actually think there is quite a bit of fun to be had with this game, but I personally lack the skill and patience to get good enough to fully appreciate what Blackfire has to offer. For me, the most interesting thing about this game is its manual. It reads like some sort of secret military mission briefing dossier that explains who you are, what your helicopter is capable of, and what the objectives of each mission are. In fact, I think you actually need the manual to figure out what you're supposed to do in each of the game's 15 missions spread across 5 levels. It even has a copy of your medical recommendation paperwork, and a diagram of the Sega Saturn mission stick controller, which I do not yet own. Strangely enough, I recommend buying this game less for the game itself, and more for the unique and creative story presentation of its manual.
Evade!
I will be covering the next 2 games in one shot, as they are in 2 installments of the same series. Notable as one of the earliest 3D platformers, Bug released shortly after the US launch of the Saturn in 1995. Developed by Real-Time Associates, the titular character was also under serious consideration to be a mascot for the Sega Saturn as a console. With no true 3D platformer starring Sonic the Hedgehog for Sega's 5th generation system, it seems fitting that the blue blur would make a cameo in the first Bug game, implying that Bug was anticipated as being the next big thing to move hardware units for Sega. The cover art portrays the title's main character accurately, a movie star insect chocked full of 90s era sass. I was amused to see that the game's plot is centered around movie scenes in which Bug does all his own stunts. The back cover reads that the bitchy Queen Cadabra has nabbed all his pals, and so now Bug has to save them before she eats them for lunch. This shocked me, as the rating on the front claims that the intended ages for this game are ages 6 and up. It also has fake review quotes cited from fictional outlets such as Squeak Previews, Rolling Flea, Worm Digest, and Bug Illustrated with puns such as, "I thought he stunk, but my aunt liked him." The sequel, Bug 2, also developed by Real-Time Associates and Sega Soft, was released in 1996 and is similar in concept, except now there are 3 characters to choose from, being Bug, Superfly, and Maggot Dog. The platforming is a bit easier in this one thanks to being able to float for a short time during jumps. To be honest, while I do enjoy these games for their characters, humor, colorful art design, and boss fights, they do tend to frustrate more than thrill me. Figuring out where to go in each level can be overwhelming, and platforming, while at times interesting and creative, lacks diagonal movement and suffers from camera issues which negatively impacts the gameplay as it prevents the player's experience from being smooth and responsive. Both titles are still a fun time, but they have started to show their age as well as their behinds. If you want to try these games out, I recommend playing with cheats so that you can mess around with the zap mechanic and skip between levels in order to see the variety these games have to offer. In all, their quirkiness and witty self-awareness make me glad to have these cheeky buggers in my collection.
EHX. The bugs are listening.
Oh, I just realized that I forgot to show some footage of the discs for Blackfire and the Bug games. Just in case you were curious, here they are, and here is a little footage of the manuals for Bug and Bug 2. They are both in black and white. Nothing overly remarkable about them, aside from the occasional pun here and there about calling the Queen Cadavra a bowl buster. But seeing things like the backs of the manuals and looking at what games were advertised with each title can be interesting as well. Now, it's time to take a break from examining the more mediocre titles in my collection and jump into one particular selection exclusive to the Japanese region. Developed by Computer Artist Production and published by Hudson Soft in 1997 for the Sega Saturn, Bulk Slash has quickly become one of my favorite games for the entire system. It is a visually appealing, technically impressive, and incredibly fun 3D action game that is easily in my top 10 favorite games on the Saturn. The cover art is somewhat inconspicuous, and to my irritation, the front of the game's manual appears to have been glued to the cover of the casing. Oddly enough, the inside only appears to be some sort of advertising slip for Hudson Soft merchandise. Instead of a true manual, all I have is a foldable poster that explains how to control the game and navigate its menus. On the other side of the poster, it appears to briefly outline the game's storyline and introduces the main character, Pilot Cress Dolly. Also, antagonist Resin Ravia, who appears to have been Cress's childhood friend, and a slew of navigator girls you can find throughout the game. If you see a floating pink helmet and walk into it, you get the option to let one of these girls join you. So far, I've only found Leanna Rhodes, a girl with some kind of military lineage who wants to settle down and get married one day, and Corin Steiner, a sergeant with quite the potty mouth. While these girls assist you in battle by guiding you to your next objective or helping you to lock onto bosses, they can also be leveled up as you play multiple times through the game. Beating the game with each of these girls and maxing out their levels to 3 unlocks cutscenes and obtains risque picture art of each girl. I have not maxed Corin to level 3, but apparently you get a cutscene for Leona at only level 2 in which you marry her. Also, I just found out that according to the manual translation, she is only 16. Okay, look, it's not my fault, you guys. How was I supposed to know she was under 18? It's not like I can read Japanese, and besides, I didn't make the game this way, so I'm not responsible for what has taken place here. Officers. Bulk Slash is awesome. It has a highly stylized visual presentation that fits perfectly with the anime aesthetic. The animations of the navigation girls make you feel like you're watching a cutscene. Controlling your mech feels responsive and tight. Switching between the ground and air modes is seamless, and both forms are useful. While in ground mode, you can use a sword to slash at enemies that get too close, launch grenades, and upgrade your standard cannon with a flamethrower, chain lightning, or spread shot napalm. In the air, you can cycle through 4 different speeds, enjoying much greater maneuverability, along with the considerable firepower of your dual cannons and smart missiles. The frantic action is further enhanced with over-the-top boss fights. Each one plays out like some kind of monster movie kaiju battle, and it is immensely gratifying to finally overwhelm your enemy and watch them burst into a flash of light. All of this is tied together with a goosebump-inducing soundtrack that makes you feel like a one-man army overcoming impossible odds. If I had to criticize, I suppose I could point out the draw distance that causes an enormous amount of pop-in. But this is a minor complaint. The game is also short. A skilled player can beat it in under an hour. Thankfully, the variety of navigation girls gives enough incentive to replay this gem again and again. Bulk Slash masterfully shuts the mouths of any claiming that the Sega Saturn lacks the ability to provide high-quality 3D gameplay. Speaking of 3D action games, Burning Rangers was developed by Sonic Team and published by Sega in 1998. I actually did own the English version of this game at one point, but had to return it as it had been damaged during shipping. Once again, we will be looking at physical media from the Japanese region, and I have to say, I really wish I could read and speak Japanese because this version of the game is a much fuller package than what got released outside of Japan. The manual is colorful and detailed, with a table of contents in English but the majority of the rest in Japanese. Inside the case are a number of promotional materials, a spine card, and a registration card. Apart from the game disc itself, there is also a miniature CD with 3 jazzy music tracks from the game that you can play on your Saturn. Unfortunately, my very naughty cat jumped up on the table one day as I was playing and knocked the case onto the floor, breaking one of the hinges entirely. Bad kitty.
Why, you little...
I have spoken on how much I adore this game in a previous video as well. The music is among the best of any in the entire Saturn library. Oddly enough, There isn't a whole lot of this excellent soundtrack playing during missions of the game. It turns out that this creative choice actually enhances the core mechanics and immersive aspects of the experience. You see, in Burning Rangers, you are a futuristic firefighter in the style of a Saturday morning Japanese Super Sentai show. Your character is able to jump large distances, glide for short spans of time, grab ledges, and nimbly dodge in multiple directions. The controls are greatly enhanced by using the Saturn's 3D control pad. Your ranger is also equipped with a cannon that converts fire into red crystals that are used to power your suit. These crystals can be used to save civilians by warping them to safety, but they also serve as protection against damage as they function in much the same way as rings do in Sonic the Hedgehog. In other words, if you take damage without any crystals in your inventory, you die. Now, to my earlier point about the lack of music in the game, as you navigate your way through the labyrinths of each mission, you will occasionally hear the sound of rushing air. This sound indicates that an explosive backdraft is about to occur, and listening for these noises are key to avoiding damage. This is why the soundtrack is suspended for the majority of each mission, so as not to distract the player from being alerted to backdrafts. There is also a navigation system in which a dispatch operator tells you where to go as you brave the fire-infested corridors of each level. Again, unless you have the English version, this will be in Japanese. But I do know enough words here and there to get the gist of what is being said, thanks to hauling crates with Shenmue 2's Duelin.
左左左右だ左左左右右右よいしょ左左左だ左左左左右右左左左右右右よいしょ左左左左よいしょ
Visually, Burning Rangers is definitely one of the Saturn's best games. As many know, the Saturn's dual video processor architecture made it extremely difficult for developers to achieve half-transparency effects. It was only through an ingenious composition of each of the console's video processors that this programming technique was made possible. The result is an impressive display of billowing, transparent flames unlike anything else seen on the console. It also taxed the computing abilities of the Saturn to its utmost, causing the game to be riddled with graphical glitches and strange collision problems. I really enjoy that the main focus of the game is on rescuing people rather than killing them. As you rescue civilians, you can check your in-game email and receive messages and passcodes as a gesture of their gratitude. This is another reason I really need to hunt down a copy of this title in English. I hear that these emails can help to unlock specific missions in which you rescue Clarice and Elliot from Nights into Dreams. Seeing as how many of the staff who worked on this game also worked on Nights, this makes a lot of sense. It is also said that there is an unlockable mission in which you get to rescue game producer and co-creator of Sonic the Hedgehog, Yuji Naka. So it's definitely worth being able to read these emails. Burning Rangers is a title that probably pushed the limits of the Sega Saturn hardware more than any other. It's also one of the system's most interesting and enjoyable games. Like so many of Yuji Naka's works, Burning Rangers is a true gaming classic. Developed and published by Sega, Clockwork Knight was released in North America for the Sega Saturn in 1995. You play as the wind-up toy knight Pepperocho, who is on a quest to save his love interest Chelsea from mysterious forces that have abducted her and transformed the surrounding toys with an evil spell into violent versions of their former selves. At first glance, this game may appear to be a Japanese ripoff of Toy Story, but it actually predates the digital Pixar film by about a year. The idea of toys coming to life in order to fight evil forces can probably be traced back to the 1816 E.T.A. Hoffman classic, The Nutcracker and the Mouse King. At the time of its release, Clockwork Knight was dismissed as nothing more than a standard side-scrolling platformer in the style of many games from the 16-bit era, a victim of anti-2D sentiment that prevailed during the time. Though designed with an interesting 3D-like presentation, most noted that the gameplay itself was largely unoriginal. Designer Katz Sato stated that the game was influenced by a 16-bit title called Mickey Mania, which saw release on the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. To me, the pre-rendered character models and ability for Pepper to pick up and throw items such as footballs, springs, and certain enemies as a means of attack smacks more of Donkey Kong Country. The thing is, I really like this game. Even if it borrows liberally from formulaic game design of an earlier era, it should hardly be faulted for this because the result is a very decent 2D style platformer. Its responsive controls have caused the game to age quite well compared to some of the other more ambitious attempts from the 5th generation of console games. And while Pepper's mustached face and medieval knight attire bring to mind Nintendo's Mario and Link from The Legend of Zelda, at least he is original in one respect. Pepperocho is the original Keyblade Master. Take that, Sora.
Okay, stop!
One significant drawback for Clockwork Knight is that it is an incredibly short game. Each of the 4 worlds or rooms have only 2 stages followed by a boss fight. Each of the boss battles are pretty enjoyable. I especially liked the fully polygonal Transformer mech toy fights. And the evil TV at the end seems to be a type of social commentary on how video games and television have replaced toys and imagination in children's lives. During the end credits, we are serenaded by a doll named Soltia, who I think has a secret crush on Pepperocho, but he's too preoccupied with Chelsea to notice. Douche. Anyway, Soltia sings a lullaby, and I recently discovered in a YouTube comment that the composer originally made this song for his baby daughter. For me, this song perfectly encapsulates my feelings toward my 8-month-old son, and I am reminded that the only reason I ever played the Sega Saturn in the first place was because of my late father gifting it to me and my brother when we were young. For me, Clockwork Knight is an enjoyable and emotional romp that transports me back to my inner child, back to tender feelings that remain as though untouched by time. A sequel was made for it on the Sega Saturn as well, and once I find a copy, I fully intend on adding it to my collection. Originally released on the Sony PlayStation, Kroc, Legend of the Gobos was ported to the Sega Saturn in 1997. It was developed by Argonaut Software, the same developer that worked on Star Fox for the Super Nintendo, and published by Fox Interactive after being turned down by Nintendo themselves. Originating as a 3D prototype starring Yoshi from Super Mario World, it was shown to Shigeru Miyamoto and may have been a significant influence in the development of Mario 64. I discovered my copy at a local retro game store a few years back and was amazed at its price. Though in excellent condition, the store owner only asked for about $10. Kroc is a charming game with a cute lead character, pleasant graphical presentation, and whimsical music. Unfortunately, its camera and controls have aged poorly over the years. The Saturn's 3D control pad helps to mitigate this situation somewhat, but putting tank controls into a traditional 3D platformer was never going to work well. The PlayStation version is technically superior to the Saturn port, with brighter colors, a more zoomed out camera, and significantly better frame rate. However, the Saturn version is a most competent port and comes so close to that of the original version that these issues do not prevent Kroc on the Saturn from being just as enjoyable in almost every regard. The storyline presented in the manual is hilarious. While explaining that Kroc was adopted by a race of creatures known as Gobos, the manual states that one historian wrote that the Gobos were among the most advanced civilizations in their day, making great strides in science and literature, a people whose intelligence shines like a beacon of light. It should be noted that this historian was himself a Gobo, and not only made numerous grammatical errors in his account, but also misspelled Gobo. Kroc, Legend of the Gobos cannot hold a candle to games like Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie, or even Spyro the Dragon. However, it is quite a good game that will likely win you over in spite of its frustrating camera and tank controls. I personally prefer it to both bug games. If you're looking for a traditional 3D platformer on the Sega Saturn, you won't be able to do better than Kroc. Alright, that concludes my collection of Saturn games, titles A through C. We've barely scratched the surface of my personal Saturn library, and next time we will see a whole slew of titles that will make even the most reluctant gamer fascinated at the caliber of games on this system. If you enjoyed this episode of Sega Trek, please let me know by leaving a like or a comment so that I know you want more. For me, part of what makes the Sega Saturn so special was its ability to bring members of my family together, even if our relationships were strained, and help create good memories to look back on. Put simply, playing it reminds me of being together with my family. During these difficult times with the coronavirus and our economic troubles, it's important to remember that we can weather any hardship as long as we do it together. I wish you all hope and comfort during these trials, and thank you for spending a little of your time with me. This video is dedicated to my good friend Corey O, who has generously gifted me with a modified Sega Saturn and a copy of Sega Ages. Shout out to my pals Tyler Stevenson and Dat Game Collector, who also helped me to feel the joy in sharing my hobby. My friends, please be safe and take care until I see you all again in the next video.